Hello, welcome to the roundtable discussion on the theme of this year's Dr. Saul and Dorothy Kitt Film Noir Festival, Border Incident, the U.S. Mexico border in Noir. I'm Rob King, the programmer of the festival, speaking to you from a rainy New York City at a Morningside campus here at Columbia. We have four panelists today: Jonathan Auerbach, Margarita de Orellana, Jonathan Ryan, and our respondent, Homi Bhabha, each with very different backgrounds in film history, in Mexican art and cultural history, in border activism, and in post-colonial theory. Each will talk for around 15 minutes before we move into a more open back and forth Q&A. Our expectation is that the event will last around 90 minutes. For those of you tuning in from Bologna and Edinburgh, may still be able to go to sleep at a reasonable time. I'd note that captions are available if you would like to activate them. That button on the bottom right of the Zoom window. Now, in selecting the theme for this year's festival and in inviting the speakers as well, my hope was to put the past in dialogue with the present on an issue that has been the hottest of hot buttons over the last 4 years. But what, I wonder, can we learn from films that were contemporary with the origins maybe of some of those controversies, especially films like Anthony Mann's Border Incident, which seemed a very timely film even today. What can we learn from a genre that characteristically trades in shades of gray about an issue that the past administration tried to paint in black and white? Let me begin with a land acknowledgement. Columbia University School of the Arts recognizes Manhattan as part of the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wappinger people. By acknowledging the legacies of displacement, migration, and settlement that have enabled us to gather, we're taking a small first step toward the long and overdue process of healing and repair. The School of the Arts will continue to confront and address issues of exclusion, erasure, and systemic discrimination in our community. And we hope that this roundtable can be one of those steps. Let's get into things then. Rather than introduce everyone at the top of this talk, I'll be introducing each panelist before they speak. Before getting to them, however, I'd like to thank Dean Carol Becker and Jana Wright of the School of the Arts, Sahel Rezayazi, our pilot festival manager, and Gordon Kitt, whose generous gift has made this festival possible. So first up is Professor Jonathan Auerbach, Emeritus Professor of English and the Distinguished Scholar Teacher at the University of Maryland. In addition to publishing a variety of articles on American literature and film and editing numerous volumes, he's the author of 5 books, including Weapons of Democracy, most recently, Propaganda, Progressivism, and American Public Opinion, and an essential text for the theme of this year's festival, Dark Borders, Film Noir and American Citizenship. He's been a Fulbright Scholar in Hungary, Portugal, Cyprus, and Tunisia. So please welcome Professor Auerbach.
Thank you. In the brief time allotted me, I'll be discussing Border Incident rather than the other 2 films. Much has been said and written about Touch of Evil and its highly self-conscious rendering of border crossing and recrossing in relation to questions of law, justice, miscegenation, hybridity, and noir, not to mention Charlton Heston and Brownface. Border Incident is not as deliberately disorienting and perhaps not quite as complex as Touch of Evil, but it is nonetheless a powerful, unsettling film that deserves to be better known. In Anthony Mann, we have a top-notch director who, prior to this movie, made a series of low-budget urban noirs with titles such as Desperate, Railroaded, and my personal favorite, Raw Deal, and who in the 1950s went on to make a series of important Westerns. So this film, with a Western landscape, but set in the present rather than a mythical past, marks a key transition for Mann. It's a very topical film, and some 70 years later clearly remains one today, as in today. I won't go into its historical context, only to say that the Bracero program was established in 1942 as a temporary emergency work program intended to replace American farm workers serving in factories and as soldiers with Mexican migrant seasonal laborers. It proved so lucrative for American agribusiness that it extended well past the end of the war up till 1964. I'm going to focus on three visual patterns developed in quick succession at the beginning of Border Incident, showing how these patterns correspond to three distinct ways of thinking about borders, questions of national belonging, and citizenship. But as I will suggest, these concepts get destabilized and undermined at key moments in the movie. The film opens with the sunny overhead shot of the All-American Canal, accompanied by the voice of an omniscient narrator in a semi-documentary style that we associate with police procedurals. Visually, what is emphasized is the canal's linearity, as well as the geometry of the Imperial Valley farmlands as a whole. This is not a natural feature of the landscape like the Rio Grande, but an engineered waterway designed to help extract wealth from the soil, as the narrator marvels that a single field of lettuce might be worth $500,000. It's important to note that the canal parallels the border, but is not the border itself. It and all the economic prosperity it represents are wholly contained within the United States, hence the name All-American, which is actually its name. This intense focus on the landscape's symmetry gets carried over in the film's subsequent narrative, shaping its depiction of law and order, as well as the reciprocity between Mexican and American governments. So we see a pair of Mexican police officers on a plane flying in one direction, followed by a shot of an American pair flying in the other direction. Pablo and Jack are seated across a rectangular table, bantering about a pretty woman, virtually mirror images of each other, with Ricardo Montalban's Mexican accent being the only sign of difference between them. The law itself is ostensibly a transnational universal principle shared by both countries engaged in a crime-fighting equal partnership. As the Mexican FBI head says, quote, "Because the criminals break the law on both sides, we will enforce the law on both sides." So there's this kind of circularity. This is what I would call the sanctioned version of the narrative. As the camera descends to shift from a vertical to a horizontal axis, we are introduced to a second visual pattern by way of a dissolve to a set of chain link fences with the dark faces of Mexicans pressed against. This is one of many images of fences that run throughout the film, signifying a kind of common sense administrative notion of boundaries or borders, separating inside from outside. What's interesting here is that the camera is situated on the US side, while the braceros are on the Mexican side. This suggests how the fence, as opposed to, say, a wall, represents a barricade permeable by sight, in this case, heightening the frustration of the braceros, who can see through the physical barrier that they cannot cross. And then at ground level, now at night, we see the barbed wire border fence itself, dividing the two countries. We might be surprised at how flimsy it is, very easy to cross. The implication here is that the physical barrier is less of a deterrent than the symbolic force of law, represented by the signs that warn prohibited and forbidden. We then see the trio of braceros surprisingly crossing not into the US, but returning to Mexico. We have suddenly entered noir territory. And this is one of the deepest, darkest, inkiest noirs, literally, thanks to John Alton's brilliant cinematographies. The Canyon of Death sets up the third visual pattern in the film. Like the All-American Canal, this is not the border, but a zone entirely contained within Mexico. This is unimproved elemental nature, a sharp contrast to the cultivated, profitable land of the Imperial Valley. Nature is savage. The braceros are brutally ambushed, robbed, and stabbed by a posse of coyotes, all of whom, with one exception, are Mexicans themselves. The quicksand that swallows the corpses shows up in a number of other noirs to signify betrayal, entrapment, and suffocation. But here I think something more pointed is going on. This is a literal rendering of a notion of citizenship originating in Rome, jus soli, that was amplified into a grander metaphysics under Hitler. Blood and soil, the idea that citizenship was defined by your ties to a homeland as well as bloodlines rather than by more cosmopolitan standards. And so we have a kind of grotesque birth in reverse, where the dead Mexicans return to the land from whence they came. At the end of the movie, we revisit the scene of the crime, and this time it is the undercover agent Pablo who is in danger of being swallowed by the elemental muck of the quicksand. Seemingly out of nowhere, American Border Patrol agents rush to his rescue, but arrive too late. He has already been valiantly rescued by his fellow countrymen, suggesting his national identity as a Mexican supersedes his identity as an officer of the law. This implies that at least in the Canyon of Death, that is, the territory of Noir, apparently universalist principles of law and order give way to more organic impulses and affiliations. Pablo's rescue is only one of many moments that unsettle and destabilize the film's sanctioned narrative. Even during Border Incident's opening semi-documentary mode, celebrating the canal, questions arise. With a surprising degree of honesty, the narrator explicitly notes that the valley's wealth is, quote, almost entirely dependent on Mexican labor. This gives the lie to the self-sufficiency of American prosperity. What sort of partnership is it with all the wealth on the US side and all the labor on the Mexican? Despite the symmetry of the landscape and the transnational law and order that would seem to follow from it, we understand Mexico and US relations as marked by darker, more problematic inequities of affluence and power. The film tries to sidestep or stabilize these unsettling implications by fetishizing the regulatory function of the border labor permits. In his previous noir, T-Men, Mann treated the counterfeiting and transport of money. Here, money is simply replaced with forged pieces of paper, as flimsy as the barbed wire border fence, easily forged, suggesting how the braceros have in effect become counterfeit persons themselves. Perhaps more to the point, the film gives no reason or rationale for how these permits are doled out. We are in the same position as the braceros, who simply wait for their names to be called by a kind of seemingly random lottery where demand clearly exceeds supply. Juan gets excited when he hears his name called, but no, it turns out to be another Juan Garcia in a familiar noir confusion of identity. The Mexican FBI chief explains that some of his uneducated countrymen allow themselves to be smuggled across, but they are clearly motivated by economic desperation that has nothing to do with education. And of course, when they are in the United States, they are vulnerable to exploitation and afforded no protection, as Pablo remarks, quote, because we are here against the law cannot help us. So the smuggled braceros occupy a kind of disorienting twilight zone between nations that cannot be simply fixed by the empty formalism of the border permits. They may function as the key defining difference between legal and illegal in the film, but these pieces of paper point to the insubstantial, arbitrary nature of the law itself. Of course, the most unsettling moment that threatens to upend the entire narrative is the death of Jack, I trust you have watched the film because I prefer not to issue a spoiler alert. It's truly surprising, remarkable scene for a number of reasons. For one thing, how utterly unexpected for a Hollywood movie then, and perhaps now, to kill off the white male police protagonist, whom we have already seen tortured shirtless, rather than his darker Mexican counterpart. Second, Pablo and Juan are forced, like the viewers, to witness helplessly in horror as the tractor slowly moves towards Jack, hoping for a last-second rescue that does not come. As they leave the truck to watch the murder, they jump over a small irrigation ditch that serves as a visual reminder of the All-American Canal that opens the film. The scene is rendered entirely in silence, except for the diegetic sounds of the unearthly tractor, which looks like something out of a science fiction movie. Wounded, struggling to crawl, crying without sound, Jack's face is caked with soil, which one commentator described as looking like baby pablum. So this is yet another soil and blood moment, but this time on the U.S. side. The rotating discs of the tractor churn the neatly ordered furrows back into elemental muck as Jack is ground up to return to the land of his birth. The Imperial Valley here is the Canyon of Death, with perhaps one crucial difference. While the Mexicans are killed by intimate hand-to-hand bracero combat, the instrument of death in the United States is a more remote mechanized tractor, an emblem of American agribusiness. The last thing Jack and we see before his earthy demise is the underbelly of this lethal machinery. The film, in the end, tries again to restore sanctioned law and order, celebrating with crossed flags the mutual partnership with our neighbor to the south. But this medal ceremony honoring the fallen officer and his counterpart Pablo only makes the Americans' absence more conspicuous, reminding us of all the other unsettling asymmetries that remain all too visible, even in the dark. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Auerbach. Just as a note, something I forgot to mention is that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window as well. So if you'd like to put in questions that might inform our discussion toward the end of the presentations today, please feel free to do so. Next up is Margarita de Orellana, who has been editor of the journal Artes de Mexico for 33 years. She received her PhD in Contemporary and Comparative History in the École des Hautes Études in Sciences Sociales in Paris. Her books include Imágenes del Pasado, Images of the Past, Cinema and History, Filming Pancho Villa, How Hollywood Shaped the Mexican Revolution, which was translated into English in 2009, and La Mano Artesanal, among others. She's also worked as a historical consultant on films and a scriptwriter for a series of documentaries on the Mexican Revolution. So please welcome Margarita de Orellana.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is really a surprise, and I really appreciate all you've done for us in bringing this to the world. This invitation to speak about films and the U.S. Mexican border takes me back many, many years ago, when I was studying a sort of archaeology of American films about Mexico and the Mexican Revolution. At that time, for me, as for many Mexicans, there was no difference between border and frontier. However, I learned the difference between the two concepts. In Spanish, they have the same significance, and we don't make a distinction. But in the American historian E.J. Turner, frontier implied forced expansion. For example, what happened when the Americans extended their territory from the east to the Pacific Ocean, riding roughshod over American Indians and Mexicans? The films I studied then, through viewings and trade papers on films about Mexico, were produced between 1908 and 1917. In those films, the Mexican side of the border generally showed anarchy and confusion. If you crossed that line, you would find yourself in danger. But if you crossed from Mexico to the US, you were safe. Thus, the word frontier, from the American theoretical point of view, was not erased completely, because somewhere deep inside the American imagination there was the feeling of why not expand, reminiscent of the 19th century hope of bringing civilization to this dark and dangerous region. The American side had more light, liberty, and order. In my work, the border was so present that I decided to consider it one of the frequent characters capable of light and darkness, next to figures like the Mexican men, which are the greasers, or the revolutionaries, all usually wearing wide-brimmed hats and sometimes ponchos, and the women, the beautiful señoritas. These two latter characters, created by American films, especially the men, immigrated a little later to Europe and were present in Westerns filmed in England and even in Denmark. As I mentioned, the border always played a significant role in those primitive American films. A pattern was established. The dark side with the perception of fear. This exotic space sometimes had peculiar names, especially in some films during the 1920s, like Santo Dinero, Guadala, Paradiso, which was the place of the perfect crime. San Mañana, also, whose main character was the son of the king of bananas. I remember a film, The Pilgrim, in which Charles Chaplin was an outlaw thrown out by an American sheriff to the Mexican side of the border as a gesture of good faith. He feels free until he turns around and he sees out of the bushes, many Mexicans started shooting each other. Fearful, he ends straddling the borderline. When the Mexican Revolution was depicted in fiction and nonfiction films and newsreels alike, it was obvious that it was more of a mise-en-scène of its own, a sort of history of acquired ideas that the filmmakers represented, describing the reality of that war. They were seeing, but they were really not observing what was really happening. Most of the time, they were viewing themselves watching, just repeating what they had learned from the stereotypes that circulated on their own side of the border through literature, dime novels, and oral tradition since the 19th century. The title of my book, La Mirada Circular, literally meant the roundabout gaze. It is explicit in that sense, although not as glamorous as the title chosen by the English editors filming Pancho. It is what a superior entity orders to an inferior one with direct instructions regarding what he sees or wants to see about you. Views or arguments that continue returning to the same starting points and never go beyond. Those perceptions kept returning to the same place in decades to come. And they appeared in many of the Westerns, including in a more exaggerated way in spaghetti Westerns. Those films kept repeating the same perceptions of Mexicans and comparing their vices with American virtues. They reaffirmed the idea that people throughout history have used their neighbors to define themselves. In portraying the other, we project onto them our weaknesses. He's like us, but inferior to us. We deny the fact they were just different. Several decades later, the three films that we just saw have their own nuances about the subject, fascinating to watch and comment with renewed points of view. About Touch of Evil, when I finished my book many years ago, I was fortunate enough to watch this film. I was curious to see how he would treat the subject. I regarded him as someone, that I'm talking about Orson Welles, as someone who always went outside the box, treating themes in a very striking manner. sometimes in great depth. He used many creative cinematographic elements that produced different effects and emotions in the public. I was impressed by the complexity of the plot, how he broke completely away from the first and subsequent ordinary films about the border and all Westerns I had seen since I was very young. Westerns and other films shown in Mexico for many years were regular commercial films with blunt characters and very similar subjects that included very schematic Mexican stereotypes, always supervised by the censors. The Mexican government had banned since the 30s all films that denigrated Mexico and Mexicans. In spite of this, Mexicans continued to be denigrated, and maybe we did not care anymore or we became accustomed to it. Wells' film had a completely different approach. The differences between each side of the border are more subtle, but they are nevertheless recognizable. We can sometimes distinguish both sides by the light that is cast on them. The Mexican side is, of course, more somber, gloomier. There is usual disorder of people, merchants with all kinds of carts crossing the streets whenever they want, even if they are the traffic signs similar to the ones in the United States. Garbage flies constantly over the heads of people. Everything tends to happen at night. The cabarets work full-time and they have a big selection of American and Mexican women. The idea of that border full of danger is present, but this time is in both sides. American streets have a bit more light, modern houses, modern streets. Nevertheless, this area also has its own dark side. There is a moment when the Mexican policeman American wife says that she feels safer on the American side, although eventually she will be attacked on that side, and in the end, she will safely return home to Mexico with her Mexican husband. The characters are amazing. They grow dramatically from melodrama to tragedy. Wells brings Shakespeare to the border. The bad American cop, one of the most fascinating characters portrayed by Orson Welles, Quinlan, an American policeman with a great reputation, but quite grotesque, fat, sweaty, with difficulty to breathe, and a drunk who has become reckless with criminal instincts and despises the good Mexican cop. The latter is an honest, proud, naive, and unlikely narcotics detective characterized by a very handsome Charlton Heston with a beautiful, strong, and brave American wife, Janet Leigh, who turns out to be a victim. She is never afraid, but becomes helpless victim of the grandees Mexican gang in what seems to take place on the American side of the border, although that is never really clear. And strangely enough, Vargas never guesses that she's being traumatized and almost raped. And of course, Grandy, the Mexican gangster, not only bad or ugly, but rather a ridiculous, clownish figure. However, what is interesting is that he clearly works the same way on both sides of the border. In pursuing the tragedy, Wells has managed to go beyond the usual stereotypes, with few exceptions, against the current for decades of so many common characterizations of Mexicans and Americans. The Mexican and the American cop seem exaggerated and almost unbelievable in this light. The rest of the criminal characters are part of the usual current. About border incidents. The film begins by describing this border divided by a huge canal like a no man's land, and later as an introductory documentary, it shows the fertile lands on the American side of the border, rich and clean. Huge agricultural land needs to be productive, and the only way apparently that can happen is through the hands and bodies of Mexican migrants, the braceros. In Spanish, the word means somebody who gives his arms for someone to hang onto them, someone who will benefit from them. This is portrayed in the film as just being fate, and not because of the lack of laborers needed. The film shows that the need to go and work is because the economic crisis is real in Mexico, as it is today. but it is not said in so many words. It can be clearly seen by the crowds of Mexican workers that wait every day or months at the border to be chosen to work legally in the US. When this film was shown in Mexico at the time, they called it human market. This desperate wait provides the opportunity for organized crime to make more profits for the people who use these workers outside legal means. The border becomes the perfect space for Mexican and American and one German crooks to take advantage of the situation. Again, an honest and scrupulous Mexican policeman, Ricardo Montalban, wants to see with his own eyes how these men exploit these undocumented workers who cross the border with their help. The American mob bosses and the one German live on the Mexican side. The Mexicans who have dark skin, bristling mustaches, and are greasy are their subordinates in all sorts of jobs. Montalban, as a make-believe bracero, will be followed by an American policeman the whole way. The crooks realize that Montalban is not a bracero because of his clean and delicate hands, and they try to kill him. During much of the action, where we watch how the crooks take advantage of the situation, the legal braceros become a silent, poor mass of men hidden like cattle in trucks, moved from one spot to another like a backdrop of illegality. They are portrayed as some kind of silent ghosts with hats and sometimes sarapes, and are moved around by crooks to their advantage. One of the cruelest sins in the history of cinema depicts the death of those illegal workers run over by a tractor and drowning in quicksand, showing the real tragedy of that type of immigration. In the end, the Mexican policeman is decorated for risking his life to help the American authorities to partly legalize immigrants. The rest of the migrants, the ones depicted as ghosts that keep crossing the border, even today, are ignored. California, which became the sixth economy in the world, probably won't recognize that one of the real reasons for its success is the cheap work of undocumented Mexicans. Where Danger Lives. This is a very short, a typical melodrama, but with a very different approach to the border as a promised land for the pathological and unfaithful woman, Margot, the main character in this film. She becomes meaner and meaner as she gets closer to the border. The border is that obscure imaginary land where she has saved money for years in a Mexican bank and wants to escape there. The cactus-filled desert road in the Wild West from San Francisco to the border is full of experiences deep on the American side. The good doctor goes to a lot of trouble to save her until he realizes that he fell in love with a pathological patient. It is too late. The border seems like the entrance to a frightening universe that never in the film becomes real, but it is very scary for the American imagination. To watch these films of the border, made in the middle of the 20th century through the lenses of the most ancient movies on the same subject, helps us to see which stereotypes evolved and which ones remained the same. The surviving cultural, racist prejudice forged even before cinema was invented reappears on each border film, but it is also present in our recent history. Remember Trump talking about criminal and rapist Mexicans while he was separating children from their families and putting them in cages. The Mexican president, also a bully, supported this cruelty. To film this story, we would need an Orson Welles to make of these two stereotypes, two tragical archetypes, dying in the garbage of history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margarita to Orellana. Our next presenter is Jonathan Ryan, who has served as the Executive Director of the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, RAICES, since 2008. RAICES provides free and low-cost legal services to underserved immigrant children, families, and refugees in Central and South Texas. Previously, he worked as a staff attorney at American Gateways, where he helped to establish the legal orientation program for adults in DHS detention. Jonathan received his BA from right here, Columbia in New York, and is a graduate of the University of Texas School of Law. Welcome, Jonathan Ryan.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thanks to everyone who's joining and all of the other panelists. Thanks so much for your introduction and for the other comments and for your very meaningful framing of this issue, and really excited to be here to talk to you all about this. I come to this issue from a bit of a different perspective than the other panelists. I'm an attorney practicing immigration law in Central and South Texas now for about the last 15 years. And since 2008 have been leading RAICES here based out of San Antonio, Texas. And want to give just a little bit of a background in terms of our organization and our work, and then speak a little bit in terms of the films and some of the themes raised. I got a chance to read them, of course, and not nearly the expert in film that our other panelists are and what they bring to this conversation. But I can report, at least in terms of our experience, RAICES has been an organization that has worked at or near the Texas-Mexico border since going back to the early 80s. It formalized as a nonprofit in 1987, but really came into existence before then as part of a sanctuary movement that was working mostly with Central Americans who at the time were fleeing the civil wars that were raging primarily in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador, and people who were providing direct assistance, community members in the Rio Grande Valley near McAllen and Brownsville, Texas, providing immediate assistance to people who were coming across the border, literally still bearing the physical wounds of the wars in those countries. And in the early years that the kind of precedent group who founded RAICES were engaged in this work, they were themselves criminalized. The U.S. attorney for that district actually sought prosecution and did prosecute and put into jail several members of the original sanctuary movement that went on to become RAICES, because of their assistance bringing individuals who were undocumented who had crossed the border to medical appointments, to their necessary, just help them stay alive, frankly, and were prosecuted. And so I think that this, these elements and themes of criminalization, I think someone mentioned how some of these movies resemble in a sense a police procedural, and certainly we see that layering of a criminal law and criminality context or analysis over what is a very human and physical place, a land of South Texas and northern Mexico. The history of our organization has really followed the need of those who are arriving mostly to the southern border of the United States and Texas for legal representation. And our identity as an organization has changed with those evolving and changing needs over time. Throughout the late 80s, RAICES worked mostly with individuals who were adjusting and legalizing their status in the wake of the Reagan amnesty, and then doing family reunification work with many of those people. In the 90s, you saw an increase of work with European refugees who were fleeing the wars there, as well as more and more Central Americans who were fleeing not just the violence in Central America, the evolving and changing violence there, but also the natural disasters that took place in the late 90s, Hurricane Mitch and a very large earthquake that took place there. My time, both as a lawyer and as a worker at RAICES, really begins in the George W. Bush administration when I first started to practice law, the event of 9/11 and its subsequent the creation subsequently of the Department of Homeland Security in 2003 as an entity, which now took, in a sense, immigration from, I think, what we saw in those films, in very much an agricultural approach, very much a close domestic approach, to what now, over the past 20 years, has been characterized by at a much more large scale and beyond criminal enforcement, but really gaining the similarities to the nation's war footing, and much more of a warlike posture beyond even just a law enforcement posture. We saw that through the George W. Bush administration, of course, in response to the 9/11 attacks, but then continuing through the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now as we begin the Biden administration. It's noteworthy, I think, to remark that in the current context of immigration in the southern border, which is mostly dominated by the Department of Homeland Security, there is only one president who has actually presided over 8 years of the less than 20 years now of the Department of Homeland Security, and that is President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden. And so now, starting with this new administration, even though we are at a beginning, and as stated, we really do have a president now who has about as much experience in the realm of immigration through the Department of Homeland Security as any that we've had before. But as to talk just a little bit about the films, I think something that it was a resounding kind of image for me, I think was an image, and it's probably a throwaway image in, I think, Touch of Evil, when you see one of the characters standing in a doorway looking out into the street, and it's a screen door, and you see the character exhale a cigarette outside from inside the room he's standing outside, and the cigarette smoke hangs there outside the door, and then he proceeds to open the door and walk outside and then close the door behind himself. And all while he does this, that cloud of smoke just sits there, and the door, and the screen door kind of passes through it, and the cloud of smoke sits there kind of undisrupted and undisturbed. And I thought that that was, for me, a really powerful metaphor for what we see, I think, in our day-to-day practice, working with immigrants and migrants and refugees who are seeking protection at the border, and this overriding but really constantly changing narrative about who the immigrants are, what the border community is, and what are the motives and intentions of the United States government's activities at the border. And what seems to arise in my own experience is that the narrative and the way in which we discuss and view immigration and immigrants has a strong relationship with the president, and that president's identity and the relationship that they seek to have with the voters of this country, and how they in a sense connect with the self-image of the United States voter. Kind of like that screen door. I mean, what's more ephemeral than smoke, and what's more kind of concrete and divisive and discrete as a door? Yet in that image, you see it's the door that actually moves and is variable, and it's this ephemeral smoke that stays the same. And very similarly in how we hear discussion, and it's happening right now, about the border take place in this country, where all of the actors, all of the motives, all of the intentions have to do with individuals who are not necessarily from that area. It changes with the passing narrative on immigrants, and in a sense with the needs of the government who is telling the story about those immigrants and that place, which, to be clear, has remained relatively constant and consistent over that entire period. I talk about how RAICES began working with Central American refugees. That is the bulk of our work today. Yet the story that is told about them has changed and evolved dramatically. That story has changed more with respect to American domestic interests, domestic narratives, than it has actually changed, in effect, itself. Much of those stories remain the same. The stories of the individuals that we are talking to today, we're talking to children in Carrizo Springs, this emergency site that has been set up by the government for unaccompanied children. Those stories really resemble the stories that we hear, that we're told to those who worked at RAICES 30 years ago with Central American refugees. In the time of George W. Bush, we heard about immigration described through the lens of terrorism. And that had so much to do with the relationship, I think, that George Bush held with the American voter in the wake of 9/11, and the maintenance of an ego that had been battered and shattered by that attack, and was now kind of projecting it, a certain image to immigrants that really responded to that that sense of a wound and an attack that had taken place. Under the presidency of Barack Obama, it's important to remember that this is someone whose presidency was challenged by birtherism, which was essentially a conspiracy theory that the president himself was an immigrant. And the narrative, which was mostly false, that he was soft on immigration, actually led to him being one of the more anti-immigrant, and of course he was titled the deporter-in-chief, one of the more enforcement first presidents that we've had with respect to immigration. Of course, the narrative under the Trump administration almost bears no introduction and not very much commentary. His presidency was launched on, rode on, and even his post-presidency sustains itself on an anti-immigrant narrative. Now that we are in the new context where we have a president who essentially defined himself not just in contrast to the Trump legacy of cruelty and xenophobia and racism, but who actually has defined himself in contrast to the Barack Obama presidency, his own time in the White House. There is only one issue in which President Biden has distinguished himself from Barack Obama, and it's on immigration. And now we're in a moment where, as often happens, the government is debating today immigration legislation, and we see at the border a story about a surge and a crisis at the border. And if we look back in history, in my short 15 years doing this work, almost every time that we've had a true meaningful discussion about legislation around immigration, there has been a coincident crisis or emergency surge at the border. And I think this again goes to the larger question of what is the story that's trying to be told? Who are the people and agents that have the control over that story to make that happen? And is it the case that presidents try to create legislation during times of a border emergency? Or is it the case that border emergencies come about coincidentally when our country confronts legislation on immigration? And so I leave that question to the viewer. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jonathan. And now for our respondent is Homi Bhabha, the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities in the English and Comparative Literature departments at Harvard University. He's the author of numerous works exploring post-colonial theory, cultural change and power, contemporary art, and cosmopolitanism. His books include Nation and Narration and The Location of Culture, as well as an important essay on stereotyping that uses Touch of Evil as a key reference point. He's an advisor of the Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives Project at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York, and curator in residence at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. He also holds honorary degrees from University Paris 8, University College London, and the Free University Berlin. So please welcome Professor Bhabha.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you, Jonathan, Margarita, Jonathan A. and Jonathan R. it would be much nicer if I could see you all as I made these remarks. And if there is no problem with it, I would love to do this rather than to address these little boxes. You know, I'm not an immigration or passport officer looking at boxes. So please, if I could see you, Margarita, and if I could see you, Jonathan and Rob, it would be just so much better to be able to address your very interesting and important papers. Thank you very much for obliging me. As I find on many occasions, I'm the least qualified person, but that's the fun of it, to be able to get into other worlds and to see what I can make of it. And very coincidentally, Jonathan Ryan, just this morning, I was giving a keynote lecture at Oxford, where I talked about the whole birtherism issue. And I just would like to bring it up, that on the speech on January the 6th, this was a lecture about democratic fragility, and my argument that the January the 6th insurrection, the most important symbol of the restoration of Trump was the gallows and the noose. This was, they kept saying, you know, hang the vice president, but for anybody watching the gallows, you thought about lynching, you thought about American racial death, whether it's social death or real death. And at that point, I just want to make this short point, or it doesn't concern the panel. I reread Trump's speech on January the 6th. And on two occasions, when he says, we must fight, we must fight, we must fight, you know, those were the words taken up for the impeachment. He follows it by saying, otherwise you won't have a country. And then he goes on to say, and what kind of country will you have? He doesn't put it like that. I'm speaking. We will be like worse than a third world country, those shithole countries. He refers to that twice. I said this in my lecture at Oxford. And then he makes a quick move to Georgia. And he said, look what I had against me. Stacey Abrams, Oprah, and Barack Hussein Obama. So in a way, it's like saying, if you want to go with those guys, are they even really American? These people are like the kind of third world in our white supremacist society. So I thought I just wanted to say that the speech is so much about race and the third world, although we see it as a speech against American democracy in general. But the question of the minority, in my reading, is central to the insurrection, absolutely central. On that very day, by the way, at the Capitol, when they were being tear gassed, the Trumpers, as you know, kept saying, I can't breathe, in a kind of mockery of George Floyd. So anyway, I just want to say, Jonathan Ryan, that I'm very much in sympathy with the way you presented the problem. And I think it's fascinating the way you suggest, do we have a surge of migrants at a point at which does the surge cause the governmental response, or is it the governmental response that causes the surge? And I think that's, if I've understood you correctly, I think that's very important. I also want to start with Jonathan Ryan, because one of the things I actually missed more fully in the presentations was something about the conventions of Noir and the way in which they actually talked about, you know, the filmic, cinematic conventions of Noir. Jonathan Auerbach mentioned them, so did Margarita in passing, but mostly we were talking about the issue of Mexico, migration, citizenship. But it took a lawyer like Jonathan Ryan to talk in terms of an image. And I think one of the issues, as I understand it, and I'm not a film theorist, forgive me, is that what film noir does is it plays with light, it plays with the ambience, and ambient light, and it's always plays with the notion of the screen. What do you see? When you see something, you see this person correctly, but if I shine the light from here, suddenly something is revealed about character, about protagonist that you wouldn't see otherwise. And when you talked about the smoke, you know, I really felt here is a lawyer who wants to be a film critic, because that's exactly what noir does. You know, it creates this sort of, it creates this smoke, it creates the miasma. And the miasma is like another filtering of light. And so much of noir is about the ideological use of light, to talk about gender, to talk about ethics, to talk about evil, a touch of evil. And the smoke becomes, or light becomes, almost like the second screen diegetically. It's the inside screen which continually says that even the screen in the film as you see it has screens within screens. And I thought, I really like that. I particularly like that because you related it to the ways, into a theme that was present right through our panel, which is about the construction of stereotypes. And the construction of stereotypes in a noir tradition is about using light only to show a certain profile of people. You know, the stereotype assumes that what you see is a kind of simplification of something. And in fact, when you connected that to the fact that you said right through your career, different moments, different governments produced this miasma. Sometimes migrants were terrorists, sometimes they were rapists, sometimes they were murderers. You see what I'm saying? These forms of projection, if I could use the technical cinematic term, which is also a psychic term, this shows us that our tribal ethno-nationalist leaders who claim to have charisma only make miasma. I always say these actually are leaders of miasma, not of charisma. And of course, the question of the migrant, the question of the border, the question of the frontier is a symbol. It's a political symbol because, as we know, the border is only in bits and pieces. This is as much of a psychic, anxiophobic. It produces a psychic anxiety through the nation. It produces a false sense of security. But, you know, it's only half done. It's half done, half not done. I was looking at pictures of the border, if I'm correct. But it creates both this sense of fury about being unprotected. So you've got to be as violent as you can on the one hand. And on the other hand, it produces a false sense of security. So in a sense, what it really shows is that borders are such liminal spaces, which is why politicians can psychically change the population through rhetoric, through other forms of discourse. So anyway, I just wanted to say that you're clearly a lawyer who wants to be a film theorist, and you should pursue this second option.
Well, when I was a comparative literature major at Columbia, my advisor told me to go to law school. So you're about 20 years late, sir. Thank you.
Well, he sent you in the wrong direction, but you know, I'm sure it's the right one too. I just wanted to then say that this notion of the stereotypy, which has been very important today, links both to the structure of film noir, which often creates the evil woman, the corrupt, the corrupt policeman, the migrant who, has only one economic mode. And then what film noir often does is at a crucial moment, it spins it. It shows you something else. That moment of what Aristotle called peripeteia, the moment where something turns and you see how a decision is made, how the form of the film changes. I think for me at least, and as I say, this is not my field, but noir has always been remarkable in terms of peripeteia. And I think I'm going back to something that Jonathan and Margarita mentioned. For me, that moment of peripeteia in noir is often done through light. The questions of light, when a light form, when bright light comes in. Light determines gender, light determines border, light determines frontier. I often say to my students, you want to think about political issues in terms of character, ideology, people's stated positions. I always say, look at the intangible things like light in Noir. Light tells you what gender is. Light tells you what the good woman or the evil woman is, etc. Light tells you how the truth gets revealed. So I love this idea that Noir deals with this intangible smoke, light, screening, projection, in order to give us a sense of how these realities, which have a psychic, which have an aesthetic element, become part of our political thinking. And if you think about the current moment, the efficacy of the shielding, the stereotypes that the ethno-nationalist leaders, whether it's in India or Turkey or Brazil or the United States, and partly in Mexico too, forgive me, the way they create this is not unlike film noir. The way they create these illusions that you can't hold on to. You know that Trump's rhetoric is mostly, they tell me these are bad people. I don't know, but they tell me they're bad people. I don't know. That sense of creating an indecision, continual indecision, is, I think, part of a political form of governance. In my own work, I've talked about it as the governance of the unprepared, of keeping populations unprepared. And there's something about Noir which also I think deals with that. You can see I'm desperately trying to find formal cinematic principles with ideological and cultural and historical arguments. I like very much then, and I'm going on much beyond my time, again, this kind of doubleness of jus solis, to go back to Jonathan Auerbach's talk, because it seems to me that if borders are both ethically deeply problematical, historically problematical, given the nature of the founding of America and the unfounding of Mexico, given these tensions, it seems to me that there is a poignant irony in the fact that often Mexican undocumented workers, and even Central American ones, but particularly I think about Mexicans here, they till the land. They're the agricultural workers. They run around making fancy gardens in Beverly Hills and California. They wait, as you know, on the roadside, and people drive up and pick them up as wage laborers to trim their cacti or to cut their hedges. And some, they pick the wine, they pick the grapes. These are the people who have, in a positive sense, the dedication to the soil in the United States. The blood, they don't have. I think they really split this notion of jus solis. I finally want, so this might be slightly fanciful, but it came to me very strongly that these are the people who work most intimately with the land in the United States, and yet they're the ones who are seen not to be accommodated, not to belong, to be continually cast away like husks once they have done their work. Finally, I just want to say, if, as I've said, film noir for me has always been fascinating in the way in which it suddenly gives you another perspective, a peripeteia. Things pivot. The guilty seem to be innocent, the innocent guilty, the way in which the shadow lines work, the way in which smoke, which is often used, is both a screen within a screen. It's a perceptual screen. It is about limits which cannot be established, rather like frontiers and boundaries. If that is the case, then I just want to end by saying that today, with almost 80 million displaced peoples in the world, Jonathan Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about, I think, between 79 and 80 million displaced peoples. Peoples who I always say may not have a nation, but they are a country. This behooves all citizens to think that beside them, to use the language of cinematic language of life, there is a shadow, there is a ghost of a displaced person standing beside you, for whom the responsibility of neighborliness, hospitality, difficult though it is, has to be embraced. And in my view, in the book that I'm writing, I'm suggesting in different contexts that the figure of the citizen, at the core of the notion of the citizen, is everything the citizen is not and wants to protect himself or herself from. And that core is the refugee. It's like a hologram. It's like a double figure. You cannot think ethically of what you want citizenship to be without a thought experiment of thinking today what the refugee is and isn't. If we need to rethink citizenship now, in the light of 80 million, 79 or 80 million displaced people, larger than the size of Great Britain, right? More or less the size of Japan, I don't know. Then we have to begin to think from the refugee to the citizen, and not the citizen to the refugee. So, my dear friends, I've talked about things I know very little about, but I've only been able to do it because you have really stimulated me and provoked me, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bhabha. Thanks for bringing together so many of the themes that arose over the course of the various presentations as well. I guess at this point we can move into the Q&A section of the of the panel for the next 20 minutes or so. But before we start to address some of the questions that you can see in the Q&A, and actually I'd say to the panelists, if you want to take a look at some of those questions, because some of them are directed specifically to some of the presentations. Before we necessarily get to those, though, are there any responses that any of the panelists would like to give to Professor Bhabha's response?
Well, I want to thank Homi because he opens my mind towards realities that I didn't study in the films, and I can think much more about what's going on between our two borders and the two peoples. And I really thank your points of view, which are rich. I didn't study film noir, but now I understand it more, because since my field of study was much backwards, this really helps me to understand even cinema. So even if you say you're not a specialist or you don't know, well, I think you do, and really illustrated me very much. Thank you.
Margarita, thank you for your generosity. Thank you.
Somebody else?
I noticed that there were a number of questions in the Q&A panel regarding the contemporary reception for some of these films, and maybe Jonathan Auerbach, you might be best positioned to answer them. A question about what the reception of Border Incident was, and also perhaps some of the reception of Touch of Evil.
Mostly reception for the 40s and 50s was simple movie reviews. So you don't get a very strong academic response till much later. So if you're talking about contemporaneous responses, standard review of Border Incident, the New York Times, a guy named Bosley Crowley would basically say something along the lines, he was struck by the symmetry and the beauty of the Imperial Valley overhead shot, but because it begins in that semi-documentary style, these things really happened. Most reviewers didn't pay much attention to the more subversive, darker implications, and viewed the movie as a kind of celebration of the police and, you know, be able to get the bad guys. So that would probably be the standard one. If you Touch of Evil is much more complicated because it was hardly released. Variety said it's a confusing movie, but arty. That was basically its line. So a movie like Touch of Evil, suddenly in 1975, with this very legendary analysis by Stephen Heath in Screen, and then Homi Bhabha's very important response in 1983, that puts Touch of Evil on the map. Whereas these other ones, because they're just reviewed, you know, by contemporary newspapers, once you get a half a dozen reviews, they kind of fall out of view, and so it's hard to generalize beyond that. I think Border Incident might have been more unusual because reviewers tend to pigeonhole. There's stereotypes, but there's also generic stereotypes. So what's so striking about Border Incident is it shifts so wildly from the documentary mode to the Western mode. They're coming up in a posse with cowboys on horseback. And then the other thing I didn't mention that's quite interesting about it, in the late 40s, you begin to get these social problem films like Pinky, which is about passing. But I don't think that aspect of the movie would have stood out for audiences and for reviewers in 1949, 1950. There are things happening on the border in 1948. There's something called the El Paso Incident, which is very interesting because what happens is you have this Bracero Treaty, but it's suspended because of violations on the United States side. But the American agribusiness is so furious and so desperate to have the land farmed that they force the Border Patrol to flood to open up the borders against the treaty, and then the Mexicans are furious. So this was a precipitating moment for the creators of Border Incident to try to connect this to sort of more pressing social problems. But reviewers generally don't go there.
I wanted to respond to something, if I could, that Homi said, talked about, and you know, in terms of the land, this focus on the land and identity, and I think this is really relevant to a lot of our work. And I think a little bit about the images that Jonathan, you kind of focused on, of when looked at from above, right? The land was the land, but then when looked at from the ground, it was a fence. And isn't that how we have transformed that area now? It's not land anymore, it's the border. We only talk about it as the border. And we've kind of almost dispossessed land of its identity as land. And now it is a border, it is a security threat, it is a set of laws, it is a complex. And I think to some of the points you were, I think, trying to push, Professor Bhabha, was, you know, why would you try to turn land into something other than land? I'd say that because it becomes easier to steal when it's not land. And I think what we've seen, you know, there was something I would say almost quaint in some of the films, even though I associate, and I feel like I've seen so many of those characters. I mean, you can take Sheriff Joe Arpaio, right, against that image of Wells in that movie. I mean, it's just right there, right? But there is a quaintness and a humanity to actually the people, and there's such a smallness in those movies. And what we have now is a vastness of the infrastructure. Every person in that movie is now a bureau, a bureaucracy, a corporate megalith. And as much as we have made the land not the land, we have made the people not people. And I think this relationship between the person and the nation state, I think this question about having 60, 80 million refugees 10 years from now, at the 50 mark, at the mid-century mark, 1 billion people on the run on this earth. Are we seeing a refugee problem, or are we seeing a fundamental shift in the relationship between the individual and the nation state? Who has power to do what to me is the fundamental question. And are those things now shifting? And I'll just say that if you talk with a member of the Department of Homeland Security who works inside of a detention center, they do not call people people. They call them bodies. Immigrants are aliens. There's no land, there's a border, there are no people, there are aliens and bodies. But there's no land, there are no humans.
Yeah. May I, Rob, may I say something? No, that's exactly why I brought up this Russian doll idea that at the heart of citizenship is the refugee, always there, and everything we try and do is to avoid that, and we can't avoid it anymore. But you know what you say about, you know, this idea about land is so important. I mean, I've lived for many years in England, and I remember I got to England the end of the Northern Irish Troubles, you know, before things were sort of resolved. And Northern Ireland was nothing other than bombs. Palestine is nothing to many people other than terrorists. Kashmir is nothing to most Indians other than non-patriotic, terroristic, anti-Indian activists. And I think that this idea is so important because, as Hannah Arendt says, you know, once you are the scum of the earth in one country, you're the scum of the earth in every country. And that's, I think, the general treatment of displaced peoples. Of course, you're quite right, Jonathan Ryan, that, you know, people are saying now, instead of thinking about the Refugee Convention and the concept of protection, which is one of the main ideas in the refugee, we should really think that the problem of the Refugee Convention, the central issue, the central ethical issue, the central metaphor is displacement of people. So it's, you know, it's the displacement that is becoming, and with climate change refugees, this will become even worse, as you know, or more grave. And, you know, I begin, that's why I begin now to think, and even this morning in my lecture at Oxford, I was just saying, let's start thinking about the polis. Let's start thinking about democracy. Let's start thinking about civil society from the perspective of migration, from the perspective of displacement, and then work out forms of territorial sovereignty, security, or whatever you want. So you know, as I say, I felt I was an outsider, but I thank you all for making me feel very welcome. Thank you.
I wanted maybe to touch on a couple of other interesting points and tie them in with some more questions that are gathering. One point that I did want to make sure that I didn't that doesn't get left out was, I think, Margarita, your interesting point about the relationship between frontiers and borders and the kind of conceptual closeness of these terms from the Mexican perspective. Whereas, you know, I mean, we tend to think of them as quite opposed. You know, the frontier is precisely something that overcomes borders, and the border happens when the frontier experience ends. And, you know, that in itself suggests an interesting way of thinking about the relation between the Western, say, as a narrative of frontiers versus some of the films that we're talking about here. But I also wanted to, I see that there was a question now about, you know, about how, you know, films set on the borders tend to be comedies, and maybe using that to think about, you know, what are the narratives of the border now? Jonathan Ryan, you made the interesting observation that, you know, the way in which we think of borders has changed, you know, over the time that you've spent, you know, working on this issue from a matter of a policing operation, which is what we see in Border Incident, of course, to something more like a wartime footing, you know, with President George W. Bush, and I wonder whether that does that shift itself generate new narratives? You know, it does noir as a genre that is about crime no, is that no longer a viable narrative for representing the immigrant experience? Because it seems that when we get, when we have those films now about the immigrant experience, to say something like Minari, for instance, these films seem to be about, these are not our enemy. In fact, they are people. There is no self-other distinction here. So they seem to be dealing with a different kind of ideological baggage.
Yes, that changed completely, and especially because now everything you can think on films on the border have nothing to do with that that part, because we have a very strong criminal, and we do have it, which are the narcos and the polleros, and all these people that are really have completely transformed the narrative. Now frontier and border now, I used it for, for very specific academic objectives, which was to try to see what happened in the minds of the Americans in the 19th century up to even the 40s and 50s. But if you see the reality today and you see the films of the border from both sides, even all these you cannot really make stereotypes, but they are, because we have organized crime in a way, especially when the migrants come from Mexico there, and they are organized also. I just saw in The Guardian an article on how the organized criminals in Mexico, they put bracelets into the migrants of different colors so that they can see which ones have not paid their passage to the other side and which ones have, and which ones are liable to be kidnapped or to be used in forced labor. So all these things that we just saw of the 40s and the 50s have huge changes. And those two concepts that I worked on a long time ago do not really apply now, because the United States are not interested in coming to Mexico and to civilize us. Not anymore. The problem now is so huge that even films won't be able to now establish where are we going to. And especially in my country, where we're going through a new dictatorship, militarizing the country for the first time in many, many years. And the militaries have a lot of relations with the narcos, with organized crime. So we're really in a situation where we don't know where we're going. That could not be represented easily without doing very bad films, and that's why those old concepts don't really work anymore. I don't know if I answered your question or you need something more that I can clarify. Okay, thank you.
I think there's something also to the fact that you see a lot of what traditionally has been associated through law enforcement with border activity, and a lot of those conversations that were depicted in Border Incident of the good members of law enforcement sitting around the table, kind of naming their roles, and I'll play this role, and this, and the pretty girls and all this talk. This is the conversation. This kind of border law enforcement is now a conversation that you see in every city, in every state of the United States. And the border, we might talk about the border now exists everywhere, through the way that we have now brought law enforcement and we've brought immigration all places. So there is a border and there's a wall in every town, in every city. And so I think there is that war-fitting kind of imagery, I think, that certainly was predominant over the past 20 years. I think it's worth recognizing right now we may be in another shift, particularly as I think even today or yesterday, Alejandro Mayorkas, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, announced that it is domestic terrorism that is now the #1 threat to this country, and how the immigrant has, I think, perpetuated and kept going the concept of the illegal which is a concept that has maintained itself throughout the course of all American history. This was defined as the slave in the Constitution. Now it is the immigrant. Now the next illegal is going to be the enemy of the state, the lone wolf domestic terrorist. And, you know, we have used the immigrant to build up this image of the illegal, to whom all punishment is warranted, against whom all force is authorized. And now that we've created that illegal, we can shift that around now, and we can place that moniker on different people. And now we can move it from the border into the interior. And I think in addition to kind of, we talk about how this immigrant crystallizes kind of the fear, I think, of the dominant power holder. I think it's very interesting. We talk about race, we talk about geography. I think we're seeing generational fear now also start to emerge. As we look at the baby boomer generation who currently and has held power, I think every single president, besides Obama, is born in the same 5-year stretch of the last time, all boomers moving on. And who are now the enemies? Who is now the threat at the border? It is children. And it is the dreamers who are not as young as they once were, but still associated with children. So now it is the child who is the threat. And it was under Barack Obama that they declared in paper women and children the #1 threat to national security.
Yes, it is very complicated, and it's getting more complicated every day. And there's no resolutions or solutions that we see in the present. It is very far for us to understand and to see where people can work towards the migrants. And I really appreciate what you're doing, because it is very important, very, very important for the migrants.
Professor Bhabha, you can unmute yourself, but would you like maybe to have the last word and to help us wrap things up here?
Well, no, I don't know about that. Maybe you should. But let me just say that I think well, maybe it's a kind of a last word, because it goes back both to the history of this, the primal scenes of the history of the making of America, and it goes back in a way to the primal moment of American cinema, or one of the primal moments of American cinema, and both come together in this notion of the frontier and the Native American, the indigenous American as the first, in a way, illegal outlaw, somebody who was connected to the land, whose land had to be taken, whose women had to be raped, whose children had to either be killed or kidnapped and then brought up in a kind of cultural appropriation. So listening to this, you know, these themes that we've talked about, land, frontier, non-citizen, and yet somebody who was always there with blood and soil, whatever you think of that idea, the frontier, I think, to the hunted down, the great satisfaction that overcoming these cruel people who look weird. I mean, they basically, you know, they look so weird. They paint their faces. They have long hair. They're completely outside the civil bond. I think that much of what we have said today returns to the origins of cinema in the Western and the origins of America in the genocide of Native Americans. Now, if that seems to you like a last word, it's a last word, or it's not.
I think so. I think so, but I don't know about the rest.
Well,
well, no, I mean, I think it certainly is. You know, in inviting all of the panelists today, I had hoped for a conversation that would spin out from the films in terms of their broader implications with respect to history and the representation of difference in the American experience of difference. And I think that certainly is what's happened. You know, the chat is being opened up at this point, I think, in the chat box, that is. But I'd like maybe to bring things in terms of the on-camera presentations to a close at this point. and to really just thank you all for making the time to share your thoughts on these films. Please, those in attendance, the audience, please be sure to stream Touch of Evil when that's available at the end of this week. And again, join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions, which were really marvelous.
Thank you.